Ok. Olá, pessoal, tudo bem? Então, fiz toda essa pesquisa em inglês. Então, tudo bem se eu dar a palestra em inglês? Pode ser? Tá, legal. Então, vamos lá. Ok. Switch languages. All right. So, I'm going to talk about mathematical modeling of group creativity and cultural evolution using game theory. So first, a common theme throughout the presentation, and I want to make sure that everyone is on board with it, is the idea of externalities. So is everyone familiar with that, externalities in economics? No. It's basically consequences imposed on others from your actions. So everything you put out into the world is going to have consequences, right? And so this is a common example in economics of a positive externality. A beekeeper keeps bees. The bees in the ecology pollinate the flowers. It's good for the ecology. It's good for everyone. So they're getting a private benefit because they can sell the honey, but they're also providing good for others. Someone practicing music at the park, that could be a good or a bad externality, if they're a beginner or not, if you like the music. So that one is, I don't know. And then a factory produces something and maybe pollutes into a river. So the factory is able to profit from their product, but they pollute and impose a negative externality on others. Right? So externalities are the consequences that get imposed on others. They can be positive or negative. So the outline of the talk, I'm going to go through some game theory basics. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with all of it. There's a lot you could say, but I'll say a little bit. Then I'll give a brief history and literature review, sort of the path that led me to where I was and the questions I asked. Right? So I asked, where do we go now with all the things I saw and learned? Then, to help me answer this question, I ran some experiments that I'll tell you about. And I decided to model creativity. So I'm presenting these things linearly, but they all sort of happened simultaneously. One helped the other, inspired the other, and so on. And so the three main things that came out of the beginnings of this modeling was a new look into the structure of games, games on networks, the structure of games on networks, and the beginnings of a mathematical theory of group creativity. Then I'll talk about where I am now, where the research is, the present and the future, what's happening and where it's going. So some basics. I'm going to focus on non-cooperative games. There's also cooperative games. That's when agents form coalitions and they divide payoffs, all this kind of thing. But I'm focusing on the non-cooperative version. And so game theory, you can think of it basically as a mathematical representation of social interactions. In these interactions, the agents participating in the interaction can choose from a possible strategy. And then the combination of the strategies everyone plays produces an outcome. And then the consequence of this outcome are payoffs. Right? So I choose something, you choose something. We end up being in a specific situation because of what we chose, and then we receive the consequences of that. And these payoffs are determined using utility functions that basically map preferences that are assumed that individuals have to the real numbers. So here in non-cooperative game theory, a big idea is that each person tries to optimize alone. Right? Everyone wants the greatest payoff. So this is a common game here in Brazil, right? Par ou ímpar, maybe to determine who's going to call the Uber or something. So the idea, right, I'm playing with one of you, I'm even, and you're odd. So if I throw down an even number and you throw down an even number, the sum of that is an even number, so I win, right? My payoffs, me, I choose between even odd, you choose between even odd, and I get the payoffs on the left, you get the payoffs on the right. So if I play even and you play even, the sum is even, I win, you lose. If I play odd and you play even, then I lose, you win. And this is an example of a zero-sum game, where whatever one person wins, the other person loses. There's also not zero-sum games, right? This is actually called a famous stag hunt game. And the idea, this goes back to to Rousseau and some political philosophy on the idea of two people are going out to hunt together. They can only hunt a stag, a deer, a large animal, if they work together. So in the morning they meet, and then they separate, and one person waits here, one person waits there, and they can only hunt the deer if one person scares it and the other person shoots it, something like this, but they need to work together. So now, there they are, spending the day waiting where they're supposed to wait to hunt this deer, and then a rabbit comes by. And they can say, well, I don't know if the other person already left and hunted a rabbit. I don't know if a deer is going to come. So should I hunt the rabbit, right? So if I hunt the rabbit, if I don't take this risk, then I get a payoff of 2 no matter what. I get the rabbit. But I'm missing out on the possibility of getting something larger, getting the deer, right? So this is an example of a not zero-sum game where even though it's cooperative game theory, even though it's non-cooperative game theory, we want to cooperate. We want to together achieve the mutually beneficial outcome. So brief history. Game theory started before this, but in the 40s, 1944, John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern released this book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. There, they really set a lot of these things straight. Like they axiomatized utility theory, which is the numerical representation of the outcome like we discussed. And they largely focused on zero-sum games. Actually, for the 40s and 50s, a lot of the focus was on zero-sum games in non-cooperative game theory and in cooperative games. So a little later, John Nash wrote his thesis in 1949, introducing the equilibrium, proving the equilibrium already existed. But he proved, basically, that all games have an equilibrium. Not necessarily a pure strategy equilibrium, but you could have where you mix your strategies. I might get into that a little more as we go on, but I don't want to spend too much time on everything. But the idea with the Nash equilibrium is that it's unilateral deviations, right? So is there a place where unilateral means one-sided, right? One-sided deviations, only one person changing, deviating. So here, for example, if I know you're playing even, I would play even. There's no way I would deviate and play odd. But if I knew that you were playing odd, then I would deviate, right? It's in my unilateral incentive to deviate from this strategy. Right, so here I would move to there. From there, I would move down to here. You would move from here to there, and you would move from the -1 to the +1. So we see that this game has no pure strategy equilibrium. There's no place where neither of us would move from. But this game does have an equilibrium, and that's in mixed strategies, which is when we make our decisions probabilistically. That's the essence of it. On the other hand, the stag hunt game, if I do the arrows showing where our unilateral incentives would lead us, we see that there's two Nash equilibria. If we're both taking the risk, why would I go from getting a 3 to getting a 2? Why would you go from getting a 3 to getting a 2? No, we're in equilibrium here. Similarly here, why would I go from a 2 to a 0? Same with you, right? So there's two equilibria. Okay, then in 1960, Thomas Schelling wrote this really amazing book, The Strategy of Conflict. And he opened the door to a deeper study of game theory. Like I was saying, in the 40s and 50s, a lot of the focus in game theory was on zero-sum games and cooperative game theory. So Schelling basically wanted to open the door to say, let's study cooperation in non-cooperative games. We can't really do that in zero-sum because that's strict competition. You win, I lose, you win. So let's go to these other classes of games where there are mutually beneficial outcomes and try to study cooperation in the face of competition, mutual collaboration in the face of competition. And he made a big deal about these externalities, mutual benefits, right? If there's an outcome that's good for both of us, that's probably has something to do with externalities. But there wasn't really the mathematical tools back then to analyze this, to see exactly where the externalities came from. Schelling also brought up the importance of coordination games, games with multiple equilibria, because the idea is if there are multiple Nash equilibria, how do we know which ones people play? So he said that in coordination games, he conjectured this idea of focal points. There's some human element to game theory, to games, that help us choose equilibria when there are many of them. Is everything good? Am I too fast? Is it okay? So this is, in essence, at its most basic, a coordination game, right? We can coordinate on both choosing strategy A, and we both win, or we can coordinate on both playing strategy B, and we both win, right? So we coordinate in life all the time, right? A cultural example for it would be we all drive on the right side of the road, right? That's a commonly used example. There's all kinds of things that we coordinate on in culture, which is, I'll skip this, which is what in 1969 a philosopher, David Lewis, made a big deal about. So he talked about convention being a fundamental mechanism in culture, right? We all are somehow on the same page about a lot of things. We're on the same page about what side of the street to drive on. We're on the same page about what words mean. We're on the same page about how we should do things, how we should act, social norms. And so he used coordination games to explain these things. And the idea with philosophers in logic, philosophy, they like to talk about possible worlds. So there are many possibilities of how the world could be. What could be the truth of certain logical statements, logical primitives. And the fascinating thing with coordination games with game theory is that game theory captures possible worlds with consequences. So I choose one strategy, you choose another strategy. By choosing our strategies, we manifest a specific state of the world, and then we suffer or enjoy the consequences of that state of the world that we created. And he also talked about signaling games, very fascinating stuff. I can't get into it here, but it's basically coordination games with information sets, and it's cool stuff. A little bit later, another philosopher, Brian Skyrms, wrote these two books, Evolution of the Social Contract and The Stag Hunt and the Evolution of Social Structure, using game theory, using coordination games to talk about how things are and why they are the way they are and why we can cooperate sometimes, why there is justice. lots of interesting things we could dive into here. But basically, one of the most important contributions coming from Skyrms to all of this was that he added dynamics, particular evolutionary game theory, to all of this. And the thing is that Schelling and David Lewis talked about these games with multiple equilibria, but Schelling talked about focal points. David Lewis talked about a concept called salience, which is basically to answer the question, which equilibrium do we end up playing? But there was no math behind that. It was just, well, for some cultural reason, for some human reason, one equilibrium is more attractive than the other, and so we end up playing that one. But then Brian Skyrms, using dynamics, was able to say, well, with dynamics, we can get populations of agents playing games to converge to everyone playing the same equilibrium. And so he used several interesting dynamics like reinforcement learning, probe and adjust, replicator dynamics. A lot of these are very, like probe and adjust, are very low cognitive capacity for these mathematical agents making decisions. And so he's able to get a lot with very little, which was an important contribution to all of this. Doing this, Skyrms end up resolving long-standing philosophical questions. He contributes to them, also opens new doors. And he tackles problems involving justice, communication, the evolution of language, convention, cooperation, and culture. Some more recent contributions is to put all of these kinds of things on networks. So economist Peyton Young put coordination games on networks, which he then used to talk about innovation diffusion. Right? The idea with the coordination game is that there's these two equilibria. His idea using those games is that one equilibrium is the status quo. We're all living the life the way we're living life. And the new equilibrium is some kind of innovation. So how do we transition from the status quo to something new? Right? That's the main question he asked here. And how does that happen on networks? How does an innovation diffuse on a network? How long does it take? What network structures favor this kind of thing? And even more recently, philosopher Kevin Zollman and some others study something they call network epistemology, which is where agents are playing these games on networks, and they're collectively pursuing truth. They're basically doing science on networks, divulging information. The information propagates through the networks, and his questions are, which networks allow us to basically find truth and not settle on the wrong answer? Okay, some more recent contributions. Jessie, Saari. This was now, I was in this research group, and this is where I started seeing all of this happening. There's all these questions coming around here with people mentioning externalities, people talking about cooperation, people talking about all these kinds of things, but we didn't have a point of view that showed us the structure of games and where were all the different mechanisms coming from? What was helping something happen and something else happen in a game? So they decomposed games orthogonally into these three components. One of them they call the strategic or the Nash component. Another one they call the behavioral or the externalities component. And another one is the kernel component. So any game can be decomposed in this way. And they show that all information in a game that's used to calculate the Nash equilibrium and other similar solution concepts is contained inside this Nash component. So there's all this other stuff in a game that doesn't get picked up, but is there affecting things. So here's just a simple example. Some game, right? I choose A, you choose B, I get $6, you get $9, right? We could make all kinds of this. Oh, that should be a 0, actually, but it's OK. So, right, any combination of our decisions, we manifest that state of the world, and then we get the consequences of us having made those decisions. So this game, decomposed, becomes these 3 separate components. Now, the Nash equilibrium is all about unilateral deviations, right? So here, 2 is better than -2. There's unilateral deviation structure in this component. Over here, there's not, right? -3, -3. How would I choose between those? I don't care. I'm going to get -3 either way. But over here, I get 3, +3, right? So it's too bad that I can't make that decision. That's your decision, right? So you can make a decision that's going to take me out of the -3s and give me a +3. And this is the culprit behind so many mysteries in game theory. It's, this part of the game structure that doesn't get picked up by Nash equilibrium. It doesn't get picked up by most of our modern solution tools. And this we can tell, this is capturing the structure of externalities, right? You choose an action, and that imposes a consequence. I can't do anything about that consequence. I just receive it. No matter what I do, I'm getting either a -3 because you played A, or I'm getting a +3 because you played B. And then the kernel component, we joked around that this was just fluff. Because it's the same, right? There's no difference between payoffs anywhere. So if your solution concept uses differences in payoffs to make any kind of deduction in game theory, this component's not going to contribute anything. So for a lot of modeling, we just ignore it. Right, so strategic or Nash component, behavioral externality component, and the kernel component. So then Jessie, one of the developers of that decomposition, with a collaborator, Ryan Kendall, in 2015, now we're getting very recent stuff, they ran this stuff in the lab. So all these people are doing, are trying to see, okay, our theory predicts, Nash equilibrium predicts people will behave this way. But in lab experiments, they're behaving all kinds of ways. They're doing all kinds of things. It's not matching what Nash equilibrium is saying. And so they said, okay, well, let's do experiments in the lab and change that behavioral component wildly. Do all kinds of crazy things with that behavioral component. And show that, of course, the lab experiments are going to vary, right? People pick up on that component. But the Nash equilibrium and other similar solution concepts don't, right? So they really, with this paper, they really showed that Nash is saying one thing, Nash equilibrium is saying one thing, but there's a lot more to games. And it's these externalities, which might be getting at this human element that Schelling was alluding to back in 1960. Questions? Example. So the idea with that, with what Dan Jessie and Ryan Kendall were doing, is that we can change this and this as much as we want. I can change this -3 to a -1,000. And with Nash equilibrium analysis and other similar types of analysis, all it's going to see is this. So I can change this, right? So if I made this 5,000 and 5,000 down here, then when humans see a game where they can get an outcome that's 5,000 minus 1, because then these get added together, of course they're going to play this, right? But Nash prediction would say they're not going to play this because they'd have a unilateral deviation of change, which might be true. Here I'd get 5,000, but then here I'd get 5,001, right? So most likely humans would just play this because they know that they need to work together to achieve this outcome. Yeah?
So the decomposition is on the utility factor.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so reading all this stuff on cultural evolution, conventions, cooperation, I thought a critical element behind all of this stuff is group creativity, right? We really drive culture forward, make scientific advancements, technological advancements, together coming up with solutions. Sure, it happens alone too, but then with game theory, I can't really model, right? Game theory is all about interaction. So group creativity drives evolution, cultural evolution, and it produces externalities, right? Together we create something, we solve a problem, we create a product that gets released into the world, that gets sold, shipped, manufactured. The whole creative and manufacturing process produces externalities all along the way. So there's all this interesting stuff. Group creativity fits in so nicely with a lot of this literature. But what we currently have, or had, still kind of have, is insufficient to explain it. And it's tied to all this stuff we saw with Schelling, Lewis, and so on. So then, okay, so group creativity fits into this. It's important to understand it. But where do we go? That's kind of what I was wondering. And so to know how to proceed, I found it necessary to identify the central factors. What are the central factors that can then be used in the modeling? And that's when I ran these experiments where I basically wanted to see all this theory and all of the things Schelling, Lewis, and Skyrms were saying in action. And usually, so there's a lot of amazing work, a lot of stuff coming out of experimental game theory, but I wanted something less confined. Because in experimental game theory, you already have a game. You give people a game to play, and they usually play in a computer lab against maybe random opponents, depending on how you set up the experiment. They sit in the computer lab and they play a literal game. So I wanted something less confined, because if I confine them, maybe I would confine the central factors too. So I wanted to have something more natural, more organic, where I could then use to guide my modeling. So I thought about musicians creating songs, jamming, improvising together. So there's some confinements, which is good, right? It's not just this complete, it's not too much going on. So they're naturally confined by their instrument. They can only speak, they can only act, decide through their instrument. And so their musical output kind of keeps track of their decision making, which is good for analysis. And so then I added another confinement, which was networks. So I had these musicians improvise on networks. I ran 9 different sessions. So the first session was just a complete network, right? A network here is going to represent the flow of the audio signals. So here, there was a sax, a violin, and 2 guitars. They were in a studio, separated. All their audio input was ran through the studio equipment, and I could say where the audio, they were all wearing headphones, and so I could say, okay, this person gets that signal, and so on. So this was like the control session. Complete network, everyone hears everybody, normal. Then I had this indirect temporal correlation, I'm calling it. I didn't know what else to call it. But so ignore this guitar for a second. Here we see each person only hears the person behind them, right? But now I introduced this guitar player because I thought it would be fascinating that, first, he's not hearing anyone, so he's just doing exactly what he wants to do. But now the violin player is hearing these 2 separate, almost independent streams of information. Now they gotta assimilate this information and pass it on to this person. They don't even know who they're passing it on to, right? They just know what they're hearing. So they get these two. And so listening to this, absolutely fascinating stuff. But so this violin player sometimes puts forth the idea of the guitar player. The guitar player doesn't respond, and neither does the saxophone until a little bit later, right? So, okay, violin says, all right, that's a good idea. I'm going to pass it on. The guitarist passes it on. By this time, the violin player says, okay, what happened to that idea? And then, so then they change, do something. Oh, but then that idea comes, right? So really cool, yeah, very, very cool stuff. Now, this one was just a pure wheel network. And again, really fascinating things happened here too, because usually in an improvisation, in music, you have this direct feedback. You put something out there, people respond to it, and you communicate in this way, and you're kind of accustomed to that. So here, maybe someone says, okay, I'm getting this piece of information, that sounds cool, I'm going to do this on top of it, but then it's not being responded to. But then they learn, oh wait, it is being responded to with a delay. And so with these recordings, you can tell there's massive confusion in the beginning, but all these pieces were about 7, 8, 9 minutes in length. Towards the middle, towards the end, you get this odd sense of synchronization. I think they kind of see that things are coming back around. So they somehow manage all of this delay and all. Really, yeah. These experiments were ran a few years ago, and I still want to build a website. I wanted to build an interactive website where you can choose who you listen to, and yeah, it'll happen. And more experiments will happen too. I mean, it's all in the plans. So this star wheel network, dang, typos. This is just a star network. So here there's one person in the center who hears everybody, but everybody only hears this person. So here, fascinating things too. There were 2 sessions of this, and a main takeaway from this star session is that I noticed 2 distinct strategies by the person in the middle. One of them seemed to do their best to tie in all of the separate pieces of musical information and tell a cohesive story, maybe in hopes of achieving this coordination between all of the musicians. So they were, this person's doing that, this person's doing that, this person's doing that. How can I put that together and respond to it all? And then the other strategy observed from the central agent was everyone is doing different things, so I'm just going to do my own thing too and keep doing it. And so, which is an interesting strategy too, right? This is where I want the music to go. It's going all these different places, so I'm just going to keep enforcing my idea, hoping that it'll bring the network, bring the song to some kind of coordination, some kind of synchronization. Then I had this star. This is the star wheel, right? So we have a star, and then we have a wheel on the outside. This one, there were some interesting things that happened too, but it's so similar to the complete network that no serious conclusions were made here or here. This one I call the wheel spokes network, right? It's a wheel on the outside, and then inside the people are connected. This is also very similar to the complete network, so nothing too dramatically interesting happened.
Did these musicians have played together?
Yeah, they were grad students in the music department where I was a grad student, and they were in the same program. They had already been in the same program together for 2 years, and their program really emphasized improvisation. So yeah. Yeah, good musicians and with experience playing together, yeah. And so running these experiments was it was like a fleeting opportunity. I had these friends in the department. They were going to graduate in a couple months. And I asked, I said, do you guys want to do these experiments? And they said yes. And then my advisor kept saying, come up with a model so you can have predictions before the experiments. And I said, but the experiments are going to happen in a week. I can't, right? So I didn't have anything theoretic going into the experiments, but I still had to run them. So the idea is that the experiments came before the theory building, but they inspired most of it. And now the idea is to build the theory, run more experiments, and then let that feed. And I tried to do some quantitative analysis with the audio signals. I won't get into it too much. Some of it was maybe decomposing the audio signals using Fourier analysis and seeing if in the different networks we could find patterns of coordination between different levels of the coefficients in the Fourier series to just see what kind of statements we could say about the coordination that was happening in the different networks. But that is more stuff to do. So some key insights. Some of these are popular ideas in economics, other places, right? So in creativity, there's path dependency, which means that everything depends on the history. So what happened before is going to inspire what happens next. All of this. Things are in constant evolution. There's transitions all the time. So I told you about Peyton Young's model on the network where people switch from one convention to the other. That happens all the time, right? And in music especially, sometimes you go to something new, then you go back to something old, then you go to something new. So there's these very interesting patterns. There's externalities within and outside of the creative process. Maybe someone plays they respond to you. They play something that you like, something that you're accustomed to playing. People might shift their attention. So that example where that violin player heard that guitar that heard nobody, and they heard the other person too, at some point they might just say, I'm going to stop focusing on this one because I'm not getting any feedback from, they're not responding to me. So that attention is a big deal. People introduce ideas. People create, right? That one's. People take lead, which sometimes might be effective, sometimes they might not be effective. And beyond taking lead, people also follow other people's leads. Some other insights is people have pressures to conform, and they have their personal preferences. So one person in the star network kept repeating their idea, right? They had a strong personal preference there, we could say, which might change, right? So you really want to do something, you have a strong personal preference for something, but no one is responding to it. So maybe you'll adjust. Yeah, so like here, you want to do something, but you don't get a response. So then you go from, instead of playing your personal preference, you maybe say, okay, I'm going to conform to the person behind me, right? And you're in a constant adjustment of your preferences, what the others are doing. There's various levels of influences. So maybe this person is influenced a lot by this guitar player, but if I had switched these two, maybe from that guitar player, they wouldn't have been so influenced. Networks, very important, right? They completely change the creative output. And people have different abilities and roles, different things they can contribute. And this is obvious in the musical sense because of the capabilities of the different instruments. So a drum, for example, can't pass on any information besides the rhythmic information, basically. They can't, if you only hear a drummer, you can't tell the tonal information of the song. So to put all this together to start modeling creativity, I went back to what Peyton Young was doing, because this idea of going from status quo to an innovation, of transitions and networks, fit really well into the experiments and the kinds of things I wanted to do. But there were some obstacles with what was happening, what was being used, and what I wanted to do, and what I observed and learned from the experiments. So one of them, for example, is that it was very common to use these one or two-dimensional symmetric models. So the assumption of symmetry is nice because it makes the math a lot easier. But then you can lose some important things. Like we were saying, the musicians have these different roles. They can communicate different kinds of informations. People have different preferences. And so assuming symmetry, we can't get any of that. Another thing that was a limitation is that sometimes on a network, you're connected to more than two people. You're connected to several people. But to simplify the modeling, to simplify the math, it was assumed that people played 2x2 games with their neighbors. So that's like saying, I'm hanging out with two of my friends, but I'm only having level 2 interactions. So that's saying, me hanging out with two friends is like me and this friend hanging out, me and that friend hanging out, added together. That's like saying there's nothing interesting, there's no additional structure coming from the fact that there's 3 people there. And one of the fascinating things of game theory is that it introduces this interdependence between the agents, right? So a 2-person game isn't the sum of 2 people making individual decisions. We're connected, right? And so limiting the modeling to just 2x2 games with neighbors is ignoring possibilities for higher order interactions. Another thing is that it was very common to use tools built with Nash equilibrium logic. So, and there we saw that's missing a lot of the externality structure. And in Peyton Young's research, there were some mysteries about when do good innovations diffuse? When do the networks end up adopting bad innovations? When do they end up going to bad equilibria? Right? It wasn't sure what was going on. These two are related, right? So the analytic tools weren't picking up important things in the games. So I went through this, I applied the decomposition. I won't get into potential functions, but basically Young used potential functions, which basically allows you to describe the unilateral deviation structure of a game using one global function. And so you can make a lot of deductions about large games using one nice function. And so I thought maybe I should look into looking at games and functions and all of this, which led me, applying the decomposition to all of this, to come up with another decomposition and a really nice, interesting, fascinating way to describe games using functions. I call it the combinatorial structure of social interaction because it's all about the combination of you with all of the people you're interacting with. So like I was saying, I'm hanging out with my 2 friends. All the possible combinations there are me and one friend, me and another friend, me and both friends, the 2 friends, right? So there's all these combinations. So here, pi 1, I'm player 1. This is my payoff. T1 is the strategy I choose. T2 is the strategy you choose. Look at how fascinating this payoff function is. I get an amount dependent only on my decision. That's alpha 1. Only depends on T1. Only depends on what I do. I get an amount gamma 1 dependent on my decision with your decision together. This is the interaction. Me and you interacting is captured over here. I get an amount beta 1 only based on your decision, right? So this is the externality. And then I get an amount no matter what. That's like that kernel term. And so, yeah, I won't get into it. But then so, to show you with 3 agents, right, I get an amount dependent only on what I do. I get an amount dependent on me and one of the persons. I get another amount dependent on me and another person. And I get an amount dependent on all of us. And then I get an externality from you. I get an externality from them. And I get an externality from your interaction, right? So there's a lot of fascinating stuff here. And some of 2x2 games with neighbors threw this out, threw that out, because these are level 3 interactions. And Nash analysis throws these out, right? So a lot of our analysis, a lot of our conclusions were being made with only this, only at this level. But there's this, there's that, and there's that. There's a lot going on. And then this extends really nicely to more agents. I have it proved for 2 strategies. I did it a little, started with 3, but the idea is to get it for any number, right? This is just, it's the combinatorial structure, right? So here we're just adding all of the all the pairs that I'm involved in, all the 3 tuples that I'm involved in. We're just adding the combinations. And all kinds of nice stuff comes out of this. So all games can have this representation. Potential functions that are part of a commonly used tool set to analyze games exclude the betas and the kappas, just like Nash. I didn't tell you about potential games, so I'll skip that. And I'll skip this too. And lots of really nice stuff came out of this and became very clear and almost obvious with this because the structure was just exposed. And a nice thing about this structure, this framework, is how it just fits with networks. Because here I have agent 1 and agent 2 are connected on a network in both directions. So they're interacting. They're playing a 2-person game. Now, let's say that player 1 doesn't get information back from 2. They're not interacting with 2. Only 2 is interacting with 1. So for 1, that's all they get. They don't get an externality from agent 2, and they don't get the interaction with agent 2, but agent 2 does, right? And there's all kinds of modifications you could make with this. Maybe player 1 maybe the externalities are on a different network, right? Maybe I still get the externality from your actions, I just don't get the interaction with you, right? There's all kinds of places this can go. And then, of course, this is just 2 individual decision problems, independent. And yeah, so I put this slide here again because now if you have, let's say you have this enormous network. Behind the scenes, what you really have is all agents have all of these, all of the pairs, all the 3 tuples, but then you just delete all of the terms that would be in this payoff function dependent on the edges that aren't on your network, right? So some obstacles now removed. 1 or 2-dimensional modeling and symmetry. Well, we have a tractable asymmetric framework. We can solve a lot of the problems for the full 7-dimensional space. Games are usually 8-dimensional, but one thing is that without the kernel, it becomes 7-dimensional. And then potential games reduce a dimension too. But I didn't explain what potential games are. Right. Another thing is that commonly it's just 2x2 games with neighbors, but now higher order terms are there. We know where they are. We know what they do. A lot of common tools are built using Nash equilibria logic, but now the externality structure is in the light, so we can use that too. And we know when it's not being used. And these mysteries that were present about good and bad innovations diffusing has to do with the externalities. And all details are now explained using the full asymmetric model. So almost done. So now to use all of this to model creativity. So my first steps was, well, let's at least talk about the experiments, the music experiments, right? And so I went through that with the preliminary modeling. I just did static games on the networks with varying parameters. So let me go back and actually show one thing that's interesting. Did I pass it? Yeah. These two functions that I was explaining, they are equivalent to a game expressed in this way, right? Alpha 1 only depends on T1. Let's say that T1 can be positive 1 or negative 1, dependent on my strategy. Then if I play positive 1, I get positive alpha 1. No matter what you do, it only depends on T1. And if I play negative 1, I get negative alpha 1, no matter what you do, right? So these functions and this matrix representation, equivalent. So what I'm calling these alphas, at least in the perspective of group creativity of the music experiments, is individual preferences. This is what I want to do independent of, it's just what I prefer. And this is what I'm going to get. This is the utility I get from making this decision no matter what. Here it's the externalities, right? This is the externality I get from you making this decision versus the externality I get from you making that decision. And that now the interaction parameter, I'm calling it pressure to conform. If my gamma 1 is positive, then I get a positive payoff when I do the same thing you do. But I get a negative payoff when I do something different. Alternatively, if my gamma 1 were negative, then I would want to do something different from you. And my positive payoffs would be exactly when I did the different things. So modeling the experiments, beginning to model creativity on the networks, I basically put that game structure on networks, and I pretty sure I proved all the situations for varying the alphas, the preferences, varying the coordination, the conforming pressures. When do certain networks produce coordination, when do they not? Got results kind of like that. Other ideas in preliminary modeling is that, right, in game theory, we think about all of these parameters as payoffs. But in creativity, in music, there's also information being generated and being passed on. So the externality terms we saw are the consequences of actions. So if I put something out there, you all get different betas from it. You all get different externalities from it. But going outside of utility and thinking about information, in the music at least, I put something out there and you receive some information, right? So now we can sort of take this structure too and talk about the flow of information on networks in social interactions using this framework. So some present future steps, because they're happening now, but they're not completed. In this modeling, the present future steps include adding a strategy. So it's part of where creativity comes in. Because the way it's being modeled now, how Peyton Young is doing the innovation diffusion, is that it's like all of a sudden an innovation appears, and we can choose to adopt it or not. And innovation is not introduced by one of the agents, right? And so that seems like an important modification to make to the modeling. And what does that do? What if a player introduces a new possibility, they introduce a new idea, an innovation, what does that do to all those equations? How does it alter the mechanics of how everyone's payoff structure was to how it will be once the innovation has been introduced? What if agents have different strategies initially? Can they learn each other's strategies? So in creativity, I'm going to solve a problem with my friend. I have my areas of expertise, my friend has their areas of expertise. Can I learn some of their strategies? Can I incorporate them into my action set? And what if another person comes into the game? So what was a 2-person game becomes a 3-person game. How does this new person being there change the structure? What new possibilities are afforded from this introduction? Lots of stuff. Introduced path dependency, like we talked about. History is important. I'll leave it at that, because, yeah, go through all of this, it's too much. So, and of course, now, I mean, the modeling, the theory is really picking itself up. And so, of course, in the plans are future experiments. There's lots of ideas now, too. Some interesting things we could do, like introduce some kind of coordination device. So all the musicians were wearing headphones. Maybe something to do would feed something into everybody's headphones to get them sort of, to help them get on the same page. See how that would affect everything. Maybe you can give agents missions. So you tell someone, okay, in the song you got to get everyone to do this, to play a certain phrase, to play a certain style. So some conclusions. New mathematical tools have been developed. Obstacles were removed, mysteries unveiled, a new framework revealed. Some central factors in group creativity have been identified, are being integrated into the modeling. And work is being done in many directions. I think I showed a lot of these directions, and there's a lot to do. And so now here I'm at VisGraph, the computer graphics laboratory, and it's really a great place for this research because the research has this living component, right? Group creativity, art, music, technology, all of these things kind of are there together, right? So besides the theory, it's interesting to see how can we put all of this stuff out there from this other direction. So use this research as inspiration to think about new ways that we could collectively create art, music, create technologies and platforms to create art and music, new platforms for us to coordinate and synchronize, and create technologies for new experiments, all kinds of good stuff. That's it. Thank you.